So today I'd like to talk about World War One and why it was called the war to end all wars, la guerre des terres in French. And I warn you that in doing so, and much of what I'm going to talk about is also covered by your textbook, but in doing so, you'll have to see sort of images and photographs that may be rather upsetting because rather graphic. In fact, because this is a period where we see the advance of mass media and photography. So why was it called the war to end all wars? Well, its unfolding was unforeseen and unexpected. It was the combination of outmoded military strategies, new technologies, and the mobilization of entire societies. So it was, in essence, a total war, and there's a definition in your textbook. It also was a worldwide war from the beginning. Not only did it involve Japan, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, colonial territories in East Africa, but it also involved millions of men from European colonies. It was also shocking for its incredible casualties. There were 10 million dead, 30 million wounded, and a genocide took place in the midst of it, where 1.5 million civilians, Armenians, died amidst global indifference. So it was ruthless, long, and bloody. It took the lives of millions and left an indelible mark on European society. But it's important to remember that this violence is not new. In fact, the colonial violence that had been unleashed at the end of the 19th century was in many ways part of this development. And we would do better to, in fact, think of World War One as part of a long development of imperial and colonial violence. Now, part of what made this particular was the fact that the war was fought with both old-fashioned notions and modern technology, which then made patriotic fervor, nationalist enthusiasm appear to be a lie, because the experience of the war was far from glorious, heroic, and the proof of a nation's greatness. We see it here in a quote from a French newspaper in 1918 from a soldier, a veteran, who says that to fight in modern war means to hide for days without moving in the depths of this watery hole. It means keeping your eyes open, listening intently, holding a grenade in your hand, eating everything cold, sliding into the mud deep up to your knees. It means going round and round around some target for hours without ever finding it. It means having bombs that come from who knows where dropping down on us. In short, it means one word: suffering. So why is that? Well, instead of being a glorious war, this war killed generations of men and left many more shell-shocked, wounded, mutilated, with a sense of waste, as this quote shows. So what exactly happened? Well, army officials planned and fought this war with old-fashioned ideas. And this was because of the Schlieffen Plan, that is, a plan that outlined for German forces to fight two opponents on two fronts by concentrating on one enemy at the time. First of all, a rapid and concentrated blow to the west against France, and the Germans anticipated defeat in 6 weeks. And then this was planned to be accompanied by light holding action against France's ally to the east, Russia. But this did not go according to plan. First of all, the Germans met Belgian resistance. The conflict became global. Japan joined in, colonies provided troops, and also became battlegrounds. And new technology brought about new forms of fighting: planes, bombs, gas, and trains. So this outdated form of military strategy, that is the cult of the offensive, was undone by a new mode of fighting that became characterized by what we call trench warfare. So what had been assumed to be an offensive war of movement became a stationary defense war. On the Western Front, there were two sides: Germans against the French and the British, which faced off along a line stretching from the North Sea all the way through Belgium and northern France to Switzerland. Millions of soldiers dug in parallel lines of trenches up to 30 feet deep that would become their homes for the next 4 years. Additionally, the firepower of sophisticated weapons such as heavy artillery and rapid-firing machine guns meant that soldiers paid dearly if they were ordered to leave the trenches for the supposed cult of the offensive. This was trench warfare. Now, in the trench, here you can see these men looking up, presumably for an airplane that is coming their way. So in the trench, men, in fact, in contrast to this photo, would experience a hell of shelling, sniper, flying body parts, rotting cadavers, and blinding gas. The average lifespan of a gunner during an attack was 30 minutes. And in addition, they had to contend with mud, lack of food, all these conditions in the thick of winter, and the boredom of life in trenches for months. So what you have is this incredible devastation that is contrasted with this incredible boredom in what becomes a home. And you can see it in the photograph. So imagine this one in the thick of winter, or the one on the left where these French soldiers hardly epitomize the kind of glorious virile patriotism that one would have expected. And in fact, this would have terrible consequences. So soldiers had to try and find ways to occupy themselves. At the top, you can see a makeshift violin of sorts, and at the bottom, having to catch the rats that would be infesting the trenches, or maybe even to provide food when there was no food to be had. This led to the appearance of a new illness called shell shock or male hysteria, sort of the ancestor of what we now call PTSD. So the term shell shock was invented during the war by the British. At the same time, it wasn't just a medical diagnosis. It became a metaphor for the trauma of war and the nature of industrialized warfare. At the same time, despite the fierce nationalist rhetoric, the common experience of war and fraternization began to occur, especially from late autumn of 1917, because of war weariness, revolt, and disenchantment of officers and generals deciding the course of the war. One infantryman, for instance, wrote, "It is only on the home front that the atmosphere is still warlike. At the battlefront here, there is far too much mutual understanding of one for the other." And imagine that these photos, which are in fact taken from the French press about French soldiers, would have been exactly the same for German soldiers, their enemies in this way. A British veteran wrote of his German opponent that they don't want to fight any more than we do. So this was a particularly masculine world where, as one soldier put it, middle-class officers and working-class draftees could become friends in that, and I quote, "wholly masculine way of life, uncomplicated by women." They had more in common in their experience of war and of the trenches than they had with people on the home front. But in the sense of fraternity, it's important to keep in mind that not everyone was included. Colonial troops, for instance, were often sent in the worst places, on the most destructive, offensive, the most deadly ones, and in the most dangerous situations. And we'll see how that unfolds with the novel you will have to read by David Diop. What makes this war especially distinctive is also the use of gas. Now, Germans made the first use of chlorine gas against the French and British forces in 1915 at Ypres, causing painful injury and death. Now, gas masks, as you can see here in a rather eerie photograph, provided protection for men and animals when they saw chlorine gas arriving. But soon, another gas was introduced, mustard gas, which did not give warning and took some time to take effect. Both sides developed chemical agents that disabled surviving soldiers so severely that in 1925, an international agreement banned their use. It was also characterized by the extensive use of bombs that, in fact, would come down them trenches and devastated both the battlefront and the countryside, as you can see here. So the casualties were incredible. They began mounting impressively in 1916. The Battle of Verdun, which lasted 9 months between February and November 1916, meant 72,000 German and French soldiers died. And it is one where Germans, for instance, fired as many as 1 million shells a day. The Battle of the Somme meant 1 million French, British, and German soldiers dying. And the Battle of Ypres, almost 500,000 British and German. Russia is the country that suffered the most casualties, 7.5 million men dead. But France is the country that suffered most in proportion to its population, 1.3 million. An entire generation was wiped out. This led to the phenomenon that we call of wounded bodies or broken faces, a French expression, because of the terrible facial mutilations that were encountered with this new technology, especially bombing. And we can see this left with soldiers, colonial soldiers, carrying some of them who is wounded. Now here, this is an important image because colonial soldiers were not an anecdotal and minor force for this conflict. In fact, in France, in addition to 90,000 native troops, or what the French called native, the French army recruited 166,000 West African soldiers, 46,000 from Madagascar, 50,000 from Indochina, 140,000 from Algeria, almost 50,000 from Tunisia, and 23,000 from Morocco. So a sizable number of their troops. And remember, those were the men sent to the most dangerous and deadly situations. The British did the same and recruited 1.5 million Indian men to fight for them. At the end of the war, one could calculate that over 4 million non-white troops had been recruited and fought in combatant and non-combatant situation. This incredible devastation and destruction led to what one historian has called the brutalization of the conscience. At the end of the conflict, there were hundreds of cemeteries and memorials throughout the whole of Europe, remembering all those who had died at the front. Now, strikingly, very often, colonial troops were not buried or memorialized there, not in the same way. So this was also along with what happened the home front. Remember, the war is a total war. That is, it transforms civilian life because the war effort needed to be upheld. Bureaucracies began to oversee factories, transportation systems, and the allocation of resources ranging from food to coal and steel and textiles, everything to support the war effort. Factories making civilian goods were converted to supply munitions and military hardware. And in Germany, the Krupp factory shifted entirely to military production. Most significantly, the war changed the gender arrangement of European societies. Because men were at war, or because governments mandated they be conscripted, a number of factory jobs and most of the military industry jobs had to be performed and undertaken by women. For instance, the British government demanded that the manufacturing of shells be performed by a labor force of 80% of women. By 1916, German General Staff passed a law permitting the conscription of women into the industrial workforce. This brought an unprecedented number of women in the workforce who were also doing what was considered men's jobs, such as here, women carpenters. They were also driving buses, engaging in usually masculine administrative jobs. In fact, the war industry was now of mostly female affairs. In England, 40% of women took their husbands' jobs. This led to what we call the militarization of society. Curfews were imposed, wages were fixed, no political opposition was allowed, in the name of the sacred union to organize an entire society into the war effort. Now, on the one hand, taking up men's job offered new possibilities and greater freedom for women, which we'll discuss, but it also meant the emergence of an exploited and underpaid working force that had little choice in the matter and little protection. And this, in fact, led to some surprising developments. For instance, in France, in the spring of 1917, there was a sudden massive wave of strikes that hit the munitions factories of Paris. Within days, nearly 43,000 metals and munition workers, that is a sixth of all factory workers, and most of them women, left their machines and joined crowds marching in the streets of industrial Paris. Now, for the government, these strikes were deemed especially dangerous because, one, they were mostly done by women. Two, they threatened the sacred union, which since the beginning of the war had bound the working class to the middle class in a national crusade against the German enemy. And this followed in the heels of an open revolt among 40,000 soldiers along the Western Front. They had mutinied to protest the war. So rather than try and address these women workers' grievances, which was that they suffered food shortages, rationing, but were also grossly underpaid, half or two-thirds of male wages, employers, state officials, and the police collaborating in trying to end street demonstration and get the women back to work, often using violence to do so. And as women were conscripted into the workforce, they bore the brunt of the difficulties of wartime because they were all at once workers, consumers, wives, mothers, and more often than not, the sole heads of households. So in the face of growing discontent and protests, especially with increasing food shortages caused by the British blockade of goods to Central Europe, there were severe food shortages that started occurring in Germany and in Austria from October 1915. Here you see women trying to buy bread. By October 1915, the police, press, and politicians increasingly remarked and drew state and public attentions to the riots and protests taking place against merchants, rural producers, and the governments in cities, especially Berlin. This was the doing of the poorest of consumers, who were all too often women, and had to suffer from all of this. In 1915 and 1916, police in Berlin reported women's anger at the unavailability of staples such as pork and potatoes. Women united around this crisis, eventually engaging in strikes and political riots. Remember that more than 700,000 Germans died of malnutrition during the war. So the public debate in Germany centered around the figure of the woman of lesser means, as you can see on your photograph. But unlike France and unlike the pre-war era, the German government did not try and repress or punish these women, but instead tried to address their concerns. So overall, the war profoundly reshaped gender roles for men and women, who in the end felt alienated from one another. Now, the expectations had been that women would indeed contribute to the war effort, and many of them did very directly, surprisingly so, but they were very visible. For instance, the women's battalion in the Soviet army, that was a striking new development, or the fact that women were to be found on the war front as nurses, helpers, but also ambulance drivers. And this developed different understandings of masculinity. Vera Brittain, a prominent British intellectual who joined the war effort after her brother had been killed and was working in military hospitals. And she recalls in her diaries her discomfort and shock when she had to take care of disabled and incapacitated soldiers. And remember, both men and women had been told that this war was to be glorious, heroic, and in fact, embody a particular masculine effort. This was the result of propaganda. The war effort had been sustained by fierce nationalist and xenophobic propaganda. The belief in the righteousness of one's nation's cause in the war was widespread in 1914. But after several months of massive casualties with no victory in sight, remember the war lasted 4 years and was supposed to last only 6 weeks, governments realized that a questioning mood was growing amongst their own citizens at home, and a concerted and centralized propaganda was needed on the home front. And here we see examples of propaganda. At the top, you see a German. You also see 2 French one showing a woman, so appealing to that masculine devotion to protecting a woman and her children and the nation. And this one says, let's never forget. Another one showing a very masculine soldiers, and the other one showing a Prussian soldier, and that's British propaganda, essentially portraying German soldiers being incredibly barbaric and brutal. So the aim of propaganda was twofold: to instill patriotism and loyalty in the citizenry at home, to foster hatred for enemies' culture, and was also designed to be geared towards soldier. So war was fought using the language of gender. Propaganda celebrated, as you can see here, male heroism, virile masculinity. Nations could be depicted as sexual predators. Family and protection of the families were often invoked. And that propaganda could take many different forms. These are posters, but there were also the kinds of postcards that were manufactured in France. Now, the one where you see a soldier and a scantily clad woman sort of is one that is semi-erotic and in fact appeals to that sense of virility, because the headline reads, always our soldiers will hold the helmet and the nipple, sort of playing on the pun in French. And on the right, you see a young child writing in imagination to his father, and the child is writing, "Daddy, don't spare any of the Germans. Mummy says that they're worth less than a dog." So in fact, this heroic masculinity that was disseminated by propaganda contrasted to the direct experience of the trenches that you saw earlier on. So in fact, when the war came to an end, there was a profound relief. And this is why we can understand how pacifism became such a powerful political force in the interwar period in the 1920s and in the 1930s. But it was also profound anxiety, because it seemed to have turned the world upside down, especially when it came to gender roles. By 1916, as many as 40% of casualties in all combat zones suffered from shell shock. In 1918, in Britain alone, more than 20 military hospitals were devoted to treating shell-shocked soldiers. This gave the impressions that soldiers had been emasculated both physically and psychically, and at the same time that the sacrifice of femininity for the war effort, hems had been raised, trousers had been worn, hair cut short, seemed to have masculinized women. These post-war years, in fact, would therefore be about working through and forgetting the war. But in the following weeks, we will look at what might have been the experience of World War I from the point of view of a West African soldier, and what that means in terms of this being also a war of empire, before thinking how the questions of gender, class, and race profoundly shape the interwar period that was also a post-war period.